but also bringing out the beauty and the nuance of cricket. The balletic kind of poises, the wonderful mental aspects of it, and so on. So we've tried not to write a political history, but to locate this amazing game in that historical context. It is political, but it's not a big P history of cricket. We really want to show the different dimensions of the experience within that unfolding history. And a feature of this period, up to 1914, is basically the failure of the fairly weak tradition of Cape liberalism. So in the Cape, there was a liberal constitution. Black people who had property and an educational qualification could vote. There were 20,000 black voters. There was a promise of an opening up of the system to include black people in this developing colonial society. People are now all within common boundaries. But as British rule went to Natal, the Free State, Transvaal, back to Kimberley and up to Rhodesia, as it was called then, things just got that almost ideal was shifted aside into a very harsh form of control, segregation, and really the main drivers were the discovery of diamonds and gold. These fabulous wealth that was discovered made Britain come in and really, after 104 years, control an area of well over 1 million square miles. Could we put it up a little more so I don't have a big voice? Okay, so South Africa in 1910 became a new country for the first time. The republics, the ex-independent chieftains, and the British colonies merged into one. And it was really to consolidate British rule and to consolidate control of the wealth effectively. In the process, Britain made a pact with the vanquished Afrikaners after the war in 1902 that basically they would move to self-government and that the promises they'd made to black people in terms of that Cape Liberal Constitution were going to fall by the way. So the South African Native Affairs Commission from 1903 to 1905, I think, worked out a future native policy, which was really the blueprint for the Natives Land Act of 1913, which led to the African people losing all but 7% of their land. It was later increased to 13%. So that was a massive move to segregation and harsh political control that Union symbolized. And with that, the failure of the inclusive project, which the cricketers aspired to. So I'll show you now that the cricket administrators and players were also newspaper editors, ministers, teachers, and journalists who set up the first organizations. And they hoped for this evolving society. With the failure of that, there was also a big impact on cricket. And the signal was really 1894. That was the Glen Grey Act, which was an early segregation move. The final conquest of Mpondo land, which was the last independent African chieftain still. Rhodes and Milton went in a grand cavalcade like an emperor to seal the conquest. And in the same month, in March, they banned Crom Hendricks from going overseas for the first time. And the ironic part, I spoke about the Western Province Cricket Club's culture, which was heavily imperial and narrow. The Transvaal and other provinces, or states as they were at that stage, actually said that Hendricks must play. He was by far the best fast bowler in South Africa, and he proved that in one match that was played in 1892 against W.W. Reid's English professionals. They beat South Africa in 1.5 days in the final test at Newlands, and the black players challenged them to a match. And in that match, Hendricks created havoc. He broke Harry Wood's thumb. He had to retire hurt. Wood had just scored 100 in the test, and the guys were hopping around. They compared Hendricks to the demon Spofford. And I've got a whole chapter on this, the very, very unchallengeable kind of credibility that this claim has, backed by all these top English professionals. And another one of the batsmen, Samsudin, scored 57 in that match, which was the highest score in the 21 matches of the tour. So the top scorer of the 1892 English tour was L. Samsudin, but he's not in that tour record. The scorecard is right on page 813, I think, in Blackland's history, but not in the official record of the tour or the statistics of the tour. So by 1894, black South African cricketers were good enough to play for South Africa, without question, and that I've written, you need to read the book to believe that claim. And another person who was probably one of the best cricketers in South Africa was Robert Grendon. He was the son of an Irishman and the daughter of a Herero chief from Namibia. He was sent to Zonneblom, the school for the sons of chiefs, and he became a teacher, and he was a poet as well, and also a political leader in Kimberley. And he ended up editing Ilanga Natal newspaper when John Dube was in America, and he became the tutor to the Swazi king. He was a Renaissance man, but he was an incredible cricketer. He scored 187 against the Kimberley White team. He was a brilliant leg spin bowler and a backward at point fielder. So that's when you know batting, leg spinning, and point fielder. But this guy was, his statistics over several seasons are quite amazing. Unlike Milton and the club here in Cape Town, the Kimberley people were much more open, and the black cricketers played a lot against the white Kimberley team. And he excelled against these guys who were winning the Intertown Championship. So a door opened slightly in the 1890s after the first tour, and it was slammed shut in 1894. Hendricks was still trying to play in league cricket for Western Province and for South Africa 8 years later. And the cabal around Milton and Rhodes at the club just said, you cannot have this black middle class getting upper team. They said he could go perhaps as a baggage man to England and help out, but he said under no circumstances would he go. And the amazing thing about this, had he gone in 1894, we could have had cricket based more on merit, because it was in 1893 that Lebrun Constantine, father of the great Sir Levi Constantine, became the first black man allowed to play for Trinidad. And during the first West Indies tour to England in 1900, he was one of 5 black players included. And as Charles Lister has pointed out in his Fire of Babylon, one of the 5, Charles Olivier, was persuaded to stay behind and play for Derbyshire in county cricket and county cricket, and then in the club leagues. So black South Africans only started doing that with Basil D'Oliveira in the 1960s. So 60 years of possible progress was stopped right there in 1894. Hendricks, Grendon, Samsudin and Arifdin and the talented players who followed them could have been sharing the same roadway as the Constantines, Olivier, the legendary George Headley and Sir Frank Worrell. In fact, South Africa was scheduled to meet the West Indians in England in the early 1900s. But in an ominous portent of what the future would hold, the match never took place. So for me, wasted opportunity and the deliberate suppression of human potential were the biggest outcomes of the decision taken by Rhodes, Milton and their jingoistic allies. That was to become the most destructive legacy of the tragedy that was apartheid. So the deliberate stunting of human potential that then comes through job reservation, Bundy education and all those things means that 100 years after the 1880s and 90s, we thought black people don't play the games. Mackay and Tini had to go to Dale College to learn cricket, which Lovedale had beaten 100 years before. It's an absolute tragedy in microcosm of the South African story, what happened in terms of cricket. So the system closes by 1910 in Union, and that segregation leading to apartheid then becomes the main theme. So it was our own version of the Big Bang Theory in the first half of the 20th century. We go on now to the first 50 years of South Africa as a country. And when we went into that, you can see there were two national bodies. We spoke about the Coloured Cricket Board, which was very organised and one of the earliest in the world. Their trophies, the Currie Cup and the Benato Trophy, which was more expensive than the Currie Cup, they proudly said. It had non-racial goals. And here were South Africa's provincial cricketers in 1913 Benato tournament at the top and 1911 at the bottom. And you can see the Diamond Fields Advertiser had one column on the Currie Cup and two columns on the Benato Trophy. So this was a proper colonial newspaper reporting this cricket, which 100 years later we had to discover as historians to prove that black people played. So segregation speeded up. And whereas in England, Australia, New Zealand, India, Pakistan, West Indies, the trend was towards a single representative body for men and sometimes for women. In South Africa, we did the opposite, splitting and expanding at a regular rate and proceeding until we virtually had the same number of national bodies in South Africa as the rest of the world put together. To make the situation even more bizarre, each board elected its own national president and executive, ran separate leagues in the same cities, organized separate provincial and state tournaments, and selected its own separate South Africa. So each one of those bodies, each chose a national team by the 1950s. So instead of the delicate harmony of black and white on the zebra-hide, South African cricket came to represent a Salvador Dali-like composition with several unconnected staircases leading nowhere. The whites-only Springboks who played in Test cricket, Saka Springboks, did not represent their country in the full sense, but were only one of seven national teams. So from those two bodies, in 1910, it went to 7 by 1950.
What were the other 5?
And that's what I want to tell you guys about now, okay? And I hope I don't run out of time. I must keep looking there. Cricket came to, the acronyms, just to get us started on that, were enough to make you dizzy. SACA, S-A-C-A, was the South African Cricket Association, for the whites only, for the white men. SACCB was the South African Coloured Cricket Board, and that's that one for the Benato. And then they started splitting off. In 1926, the South African Independent Coloured Cricket Board was started, SAICB. Then there was an SABCB, an SAICU, an SACBOC, and an SARWCA. Okay, so I'll just get you going with that state of confusion and then try and show. And this is the beauty of our work, is that we've actually given each of these organizations the reasons for their emergence, how they were formed, who the administrators, top players and champion teams were, a historical overview of their development, statistics for their main competitions and tournaments, a comprehensive list of national and provincial players, details about matches played by the various national teams. So if you asked anyone 10 years ago, tell us the 11 national boards, there would probably only have been 3 or 4 people in South Africa who could answer that. Unfortunately, 2 of them decided to write this history because people just simply would not have known about it. Even the black cricketers themselves just had no idea anymore of this past. So I'm going to take you on this easy journey through this virtually unknown and remarkable story by way of photographs. And that'll take us to 1960, and then we'll hand over to Colin, and tomorrow bring it up to date. Okay? So let's look at these organizations. On the way, of course, from the soon after Union of South Africa, the ANC was formed in 1912 as a native parliament to oppose the Calabar Constitution and state, and the National Party was formed in 1913. 2 of the Charlie Fitzgerald and Saka Springbok was one of the 4 founders of the National Party with General Hertzog in 1913. Walter Khubusana, translator of the Bible into Xhosa, and a gentleman, as you can see, was president of the Border Native Cricket Union and one of the founders of the ANC. Together, of course, with Isaiah Mbele, who was the secretary of the South African Coloured Cricket Board, and he was the brother-in-law of Saul Clarke, who became famous. Dr. Abdullah Abdurrahman, who was the Western Province Coloured Cricket Union's president, obviously started the APO and organised with the ANC against that. Intellectuals like S.E. Kane Kai, who was a famous poet and writer who crossed from oral poetry into written writing, composed poems about cricket and how we must bowl Voortaan smacks out and put in Makato as president or opening batsman and so on. And then the war happened straight after this, a massive disruption. If you want to understand 20th century cricket or the first half of it, think of this: no tournaments between 1913 and 1920 for the whites, none between 1913 and 22 for the Coloured Cricket Board, and World War II was even more disruptive. There were only 2 Currie Cups between 1937-38 and 1951-52. The 2 Currie Cups in more than 12 or 13 years. The black players cricket was totally disrupted by the war. Many people died. Cricketers were sent there, and 2 of them were Albert Christopher and Sudyalia, went with the, following in the Gandhi kind of tradition, they went as stretcher bearers and medics to East Africa and elsewhere, facing great danger, and got a DSO, which is the highest, and the highest rank, which was Sergeant Major, because black people couldn't be officers in the war. If you look here, this is the camp in Namibia during the war, playing cricket, and from cricket whites to khaki was the whole kind of romance of going to war. Arthur Conan Doyle said there was a time for everything, but there's a time for one thing now, and that thing is war. If a cricketer has a straight eye, let him look along the barrel of a rifle. If a footballer had a strength of limb, let him serve and march in the field of battle. So it's that old way of sending people off to war to die. Masses of, as Colin said, young people were cut down in World War I. More casualties than all the wars in history together up to that stage. And World War II was the same. A.J. Freeman up there was a Benny Osler of the Malays, as they called him, and the handler of the SACCB cricket. He went to war, his whole club in District 6 disappeared as well, and there were no fixtures there. The guys playing in the desert. There was a Cape Court team in Alexandria in Egypt which beat Australians, South Africans and English teams to win the divisional championships. But this is an amazing photo of 5 or 6 South African players in World War II, including Briscoe, who was shot in machine gun fire and died, and they very vivid descriptions of it. It's an incredible story, the war experiences, the whole thing of masculinity, sport and war, which I deal with in quite a lot of detail if you do manage to read the book. And of course by 52, this is I think the 56 MCC team. General Magnus Milan is watching there, with Verwoerd there, and Janssen, the Governor General. They did not wear this British ceremonial uniforms for Governor Generals because they were Republicans, but they went to watch the cricket and supported the cricket of Saka, the white body, quite a lot. And of course in that decade started the first official government policy, strictly saying black and white can't play together. So Saka is the first one, and it was started in 1890, lasted until 1977. Its main competition, as you know, was the Currie Cup. They're the affiliated provinces. So I put in for each one their trophy, the Currie Cup. There's the Springbok badge. That's Peter Heine's group that is in Johannesburg Afrikaner Library. That's Jack Plimsoll's kit bag for touring Australia. It's quite a heavy trunk. But of course, the romance of that time was the boat trips to England and the great kind of royal festivals of the aristocratic elite, as we said. Very beautiful photos that I've got from personal albums here. We jump back a bit, but there's some of the great players of the early period: Jimmy Sinclair, Barberton, Halliwell, and the 4 spinners who won South Africa their first series in 1906. This is Boerion Kotze, with 300 wickets. In first-class cricket, he was very fast, and the slip Colin often dropped his catches. And that was the triangular tournament in Britain. That's Charles Fry, who played for England in 4 sports, wrote books, and stood for Parliament. These are the Aussies in South Africa at the Big Falls, saluting Rhodes there in the statue. Very sort of beautiful anthropological pictures, if one has got time to go into them, of the kind of visit to the colonies by British and Australians. So that was the other way. There's more in the 20s and 30s of the boat trip. Women were not allowed to go with their husbands even on those trips. They had to take a separate boat to go to England, even though it took how many weeks by that time? Probably 3 weeks or so. And they play on board regularly. And of course, the royal kind of visit, the royal handshake and functions were every tour. Eric Rowan was an amazing player there. Klaus van Reineveld died recently. Wonderful man. He captained South Africa, and put that photo of him in there. And Jack Cheatham, of course, created a sensation in the 50s after South Africa had lost 9 out of 10 tests heavily to the Australians, often by an innings. They went and drew the series for the first time with Australia. But this was in England, and you can see the beginning of the television age. There's the BBC rolling out for cricket. And that is a whole important aspect if you want to understand sport after 1960. Our television totally changes things. Okay, so the second one then is a South African Coloured Cricket Board, or the Malay, or the Banato Board as it was called. This is Tiffy Barnes's father, and his grandfather played. He's a match referee now for Cricket South Africa and played with Eddie Barlow and then during normal cricket times. So you have these, like the Pollocks in white cricket, you have these long lineages also in the non-racial cricket. I love this photo. My friends who I played, my club mates, found this in a cupboard at home of their great-grandfather. And this is Talib Saleh, who captained Western Province from 1924 to 1946. And it's so good that they invited him to play county cricket, but there weren't many mosques in England in 1930, and he said, I can't, give up my lifestyle kind of thing. This was the Dol Freeman, the beautiful rugby and cricket player, the Malay. And I love these kufias, but look at them. It could be Ranjit Singh playing for Sussex. It's a cricket culture that's deep there, as you can see. This is Saleh 20 years later when they celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Benato Board in the Jubilee tournament. So this is how entrenched and deep these cultures of cricket were. And when I wrote my first book as a student, I interviewed Sid Reddy, who was the secretary of SACPOC. And on the mantelpiece there was a beautiful trophy, I remember. He gave me his collection when he got older. And when I became CEO at Newlands, I thought I must try and find that trophy. His son is Sam Reddy, who was the first ETV newsreader I've met. And Sam said, you know what, it's amazing that you phoned me, because last week there was a burglary and all my mom's stuff was stolen except that trophy. And he gave it to us, and Mr. Jamil and Mahmoud was the last surviving member of that thing. I handed it over to Graham Smith and Ashwell, and it's now kept at Newlands. Very, very deep kind of history that we can all own as South Africans. It's not about proving us and them, it's about creating meaning through different and shared experiences in the game. And the third one, then in 1926, a South African independent coloured cricket board is set up. It plays for the Sir David Harris Trophy, also named after a mining magnate, and they were for Christian colours. They felt that the Africans and Muslims in Kimberley were dominating too much. It became a kind of coloured ethnicity thing, which the politics of the 1920s encouraged. So you had the urban areas legislation, which created the Langas and other townships. Langa was started in 1926. By 1929, there was a Western Province Bantu Cricket Board. So people were pushed out of town, they start organising on the basis of ethnicity. And in the coloured area, Herzog and Smuts were fighting to become Prime Minister, and those 20,000 Cape voters could still determine a couple of constituencies in the Eastern Cape, especially around Cape Town. So there's Herzog he said that he would treat coloured people more than the Africans in his labour policies, the beginning of the coloured labour preference policy, and as long as because they were similar to whites, but they must not try to integrate. They must stay separate but similar. And a conservative section of coloured opinion started two political organisations, broke away in sport as well, from, remember, the inclusive SACCB or the NATO thing, based on the old liberal tradition, which is now becoming basically a mirage as segregation grew. And this specifically said we're for coloured Christians, and this is in later years where Basil D'Oliveira played, but they formed the Diamond Fields Cricket Union in opposition to the Curricula and West Coast Cricket Union. They played their own interprovincial tournaments. Eastern Province there, Jas D'Oliveira, he played at the age of 17 in 1947 in the Sir Davis Harris trophies. He scored 100 centuries in cricket in Cape Town before he went overseas. He lied about his age so he could get picked for England, and he retired at the age of 46, scoring a half century off Joe Garner playing for Worcestershire. That was an absolutely amazing person, and you can just see from the archives of that time, he just scored massive runs. And then the third board, after the independent coloured cricket board, breaking away in 1932, was the South African Bantu Cricket Board. This was the African cricketers, and again, there are very good explanations for this. In the beginning, when we spoke yesterday, that tradition was in the Eastern Cape, very strong. But with Johannesburg becoming the centre of the economy, many migrants from the Eastern Cape went up to the mines. And because they came out of the mission schools, they occupied positions of clerks, interpreters, and so on. And many of them got jobs on the mines to help organize the mine workers' recreation. And so the NRC trophy was formed, started by the Chamber of Mines for South African Bantu Cricket Board. There was also the sense that African self-determination was important politically, so you see these breakaways in other sports as well. It becomes part of a trend. And in the first Banato interprovincial tournament, Queenstown, King Williamstown, East London played as virtual provinces against Eastern Province, Griqualand West and Cape Town. And half the Griqualand West people were coloured and African players. By 1930, only a few players playing for Griqualand West, Africans. They were no longer being covered by the Banato Trophy, so they formed their own organisation. This is a wonderful gentleman, Mr. Pendler, who was the head of the Cape ANC in that time. He was the manager of the team. Mr. Mama was the descendant of the first chief to become Christianized by the missionaries, Chief Kama, in 1806 or 1809 or 1811, very early, and his grandson died the other day. I went to his funeral in Langa. Absolutely amazing to think of that historical line. Dying with a full, absolutely packed church of black faces, but no one else knows about this guy. And he's part of the chiefly tradition of education and Christianity from 1811. And he was the headmaster of the biggest school for Africans in Cape Town. So this is Eric Majola, the son of Kaya Majola and Gerald Majola, the father of who became CEO of South African cricket in 2003. He was a legendary sportsman. They called him the Benny Osler of fly halves. And that's the four top players in Eastern Province. You can just see the kind of body language of sportsmen. This was now in Drum Magazine and in the Bantu World and so on. Ex-Mints, George Longa bowls fast with ex-Mints and so on. It's a wonderful little graphics of the urbanization that was happening in the 50s as well. And this is an amazing photo. This is Canon Zidi. It's Tamiso Lekile's grandfather in Langa in the 1950s. He played for the South African Bantu Cricket Board team. And he's got a tennis racket in one hand. He's portraying himself as an absolute sportsman that he was. So Tamiso Lekile didn't emerge from nowhere. It was a generational thing, just like Themba Bavuma as well. And that's the Western Province team in the 50s. Very poignant kind of hand photographed and so on. Also, in terms of the archive, it's so beautiful, the story. I got this from his granddaughter. And she was studying in Grahamstown, and he said, meet me on the corner, in Alice, meet me on a corner. He was living in the Eastern Cape. She remembers meeting her grandfather, and he gave her half a shilling, and she never forgot that, and gave her these photos. And so they were very, very special to her with this memory of connection. And then in 1940, the third ethnic breakaway happened, the South African Indian Cricket Union. The Indian cricketers were based only in Durban and Johannesburg for historical reasons. That's where people obviously migrated to from 1860 to work on the sugarcane fields, like people did in Trinidad and Fiji and elsewhere. And by then there were third and fourth generation South Africans starting to participate in an organized way in activity here rather than thinking only about home. The people were very organized. That is Rashid Baracha, sorry. Oops, there's not enough. Rashid Baracha, who became president of the first normal cricket board in the 1970s. They had very strong administrators and also resources. There's the SA Indian cricket cap from the 50s. Look at the programs there. Very good documentation, incredible minutes. They were based in Colbert House, their board meetings, which is where Dr. Dadu signed the doctor's pack and where Ahmed Katrada had a flat. So these kind of connections were there already in the 40s and 50s. And the other important thing about the Indian cricketers was that they opened up contacts with the rest of the world. In the 50s, black South Africans started saying, not only are we against apartheid, but we also want to play international sport. So you had David Samai at Wimbledon, you had Papua Sibolom winning the Dutch Open, you had rugby players playing out, the soccer players, Kalamazoo, Comey and others who played English professional leagues and so on. And the Indian administrators had connections to India, Pakistan, Trinidad and East Africa, and that's how black cricketers started going beyond the borders. And the sixth one is quite remarkable and very historic. Two things happen in the 1950s. Women start forming a national organization for the first time, and the black players start trying to unite again. So we had the Banato board that saw no divisions of creed, color and nationality, but they then broke away. But following the Indian model, actually, the communalism model that Colin spoke about, in 1936 they started, Reverend Sigamini in Johannesburg initiated the inter-race cricket board between the provincial units of the different racial boards in Johannesburg. And in the 50s, they then formed SACPA, the South African Cricket Board of Control, which starts inter-race cricket with the aim of picking one national team and improving the general standard of non-European cricketers, it was called then, because this fragmentation was weakening the game. But before that, and this came after, the South Africa and Rhodesia Women's Cricket Association was formed in 1952, and they started competing for the Simons Trophy every year. I'd love to speak a bit about them if I can, but let's just go through everything and I can come back to them if I have more time. But just look at these photos and it'll blow you away. This is Ellis Park in 1906. This is Newlands in the 1890s. You see the women are present. The ceremonial function of women is built into cricket. In every tour report that you read, Lady Anne Barnard, when Charles Anguish came to the Cape, even she knew Anguish and went to a retreat in the lower slopes of Newlands Forest, where the governor allowed people to be, what do they call it, rural. So it is like a hideaway cottage, like a roundhouse in Dunbar's Kloof, where the upper class people went. So she knew Charles Anguish, and from that time on, women are part of the growth of cricket, including African women, And I've just forgot to put that slide in. But here they're playing by 1900 at the Wanderers, at Ramblers in Free State were the two strongest original places. And the first school, Rodine School, was formed after the World War, was based on Rodine in Sussex, which is the pioneer of women's cricket. Their school song had a cricket theme in one of the verses. They gave blazers, first-team blazers, like boys' schools for cricket. The school magazine of Rodine is wonderful to read over those years. Colin says I must move on here, and he's right. Okay, so one of the pioneers of women's cricket was, what was her first name now? Kingswell, I'm sorry, I don't, her first name, she was Eva Kingswell. Yes, no, those are twins. So she was a suffragette and the wife of the editor of the Cape Times in 1910. She resigned from the Wanderers when they told her the women couldn't practice there because the men had to come in. And she fought for organised women's sport, starting school competitions and the Cape Peninsula Ladies Cricket Club, which linked up, which affiliated to the Women's Cricket Association in England in 1932. And that was the first attempt to play organised cricket rather than recreational cricket in South Africa. And the war then intervened. They handed all their cricket kit in to the war effort for the troops and resuscitated it after the war and started the South African and Rhodesia Women's Cricket Association. This is, again, the Port Elizabeth Cricket and Rugby Club doing their Christmas outing in the 1950s. Women were also playing by black women in Kimberley by 1910 in these social games between men and women. But I love these photos. That's the first champion team of provincial cricket. Vicky Valentine Brown was a Wimbledon quarter-finalist in tennis. And just listen what she had to say about it. Unlike tennis, cricket is not light-hearted and social. Cricket is an intelligent game and demands teamwork, enthusiasm, patience, knowledge, and years of practicing. It is my whole life, she added. I love these things. So it was not an explicitly political move, although people were playing in a ghetto and they were resisting it. But some of the people were very highly qualified professionals and were out-and-out feminists, like Dr. Muriel Ritchie from Southern Transvaal, who explained during the 1956 tournament, "I've never had the time to get married, but having to play cricket, it is the best game that a woman can play. It gives you excellent exercise without overexerting one. It is physically and emotionally healthy relaxation. It teaches you to concentrate and it develops the coordination between brain and body. It has no negative effects." Now, what more precise explanation can you get for cricket? And Christine Ball was just hit straight to the core, because the gentleman's game was a socially constructed concept. Women, it was for officers and gentlemen who were going to rule empire, and patriarchy had to be maintained. And as I said, Grace said they're neither women nor cricketers. But Christine Ball said, "I see nothing unfeminine about cricket. It is no different from women playing tennis, golf or hockey." Again, a very simple argument which prejudice basically stopped from becoming a reality until now. That's the first tournament. Transvaal and Western Province teams waiting and listening to the commentary of the men's game. I love this picture as well. So you've got the stereotypes, the femininity, the political aspects, just the common camaraderie that comes with it. The scrapbooks are wonderful to look at and preserve real study by people involved in gender studies and so on. So to create a gendered history of cricket is part of our aim, but we're not We're just starting out on that path. So that's Donavier's team that went to Kimberley. And Peter Oborn has written that this is the first South African team, really, because it was open to all South Africans in 1956. This team went to Kenya, and it actually is the moment in the 50s where the non-racial movement starts becoming the trendsetter of the future. You have the South African captains from those different bodies. And again, I just come and show you my archive. Here's the bunker tournament for the scorecards. You have these wonderful, Pete Gwele was a great fielder. HMJ Masiza was in the first class at Fort Hare in 1918, and without any prompting, they went and cleared ground to make a cricket field. So he became president of Cricket South Africa. He was a great choir master. Also, a cricket scorebook that I got, and look at that program from the 50s. And this is from the Women's Archive. I've got 8 boxes of archive, very complete, and the most beautiful minute books and records from which we got these statistics of 80 tournaments. 65 tournaments between 1910 and 1960, while there were only 20 Currie Cup tournaments. There's a whole life out there in cricket that we haven't known about yet. And when we know that, we can start being more relaxed about going forward in the sense of togetherness, in my opinion. Thanks very much. And you'll take 25 minutes, so we'll be ready by 8. Am I audible? After André's multicolored presentation, I'm going to stick much more narrowly this evening to Saka cricket, to white cricket. And I do so because the 1960s, in many ways, was an absolutely momentous year in the history, a decade in the history of South African cricket, particularly white cricket. And I'm just going to locate for a moment the 1960s in South African history more generally. Apartheid obviously began in the National Party victory of 1948 and consolidated through the 1950s, a lot of bedrock legislation. But from 1960 to 73 is a distinct phase in the history of apartheid. It is the high tide of apartheid, the project at its peak. Partly because the state swept all opposition aside. Partly because it embarked on the so-called grand apartheid with the delusional self-governing statelets. Partly because it used social engineering on a scale that normally only operates during war. 3.5 million Africans were forcibly removed and relocated, almost entirely dumped into the Bantustans. Economically, the 1960s was a period of sustained growth. GDP grew at over 5% a year for 13 years. Middle-class whites reveled in affluence. They discovered foreign travel. They bought houses, pools, and cars with unprecedented ease. Under Verwoerd and then Forster, the state became more authoritarian, introduced ruthless policing, and a massive increase of spending on security. The PAC and ANC were banned. Organized black resistance was effectively extinguished by 1965 internally. Now, this combination of krachtdadigheid and prosperity saw the National Party supported more broadly by white South Africans, which meant a lot of English-speaking white South Africans supported the NP in these years. In the 1966 general election, the National Party won 126 of the 166 seats.
in Parliament. If the 60s was a decade of white affluence and political complacency, South Africa's white cricketers also exhibited a new confidence and authority in the 60s. It's easy to forget, André touched on it this evening, that for the first 80 years of their existence, the South African white test cricket was largely dominated by defeats at the hands of England and Australia. There was an upturn in the 50s when South Africa for the first time had a pair of threatening fast bowlers, Adcock and Heine, and an outstanding spinner in Hugh Taylor. But it was in the 60s that a new side emerged with the Pollock brothers, Bland, Barlow, Lindsay, and hangover from the 50s, Trevor Goddard. And then in the second half of the 1960s, this core group was further strengthened by the phenomenal talents of Barry Richards and Mike Potter. The teams boasting this generation of players went from strength to strength. In 1965, Peter van der Merwe's side won a series in England for the first time in 30 years. The victory secured by Pollock's glorious century at Trent Bridge. 66-67, Bob Simpson's touring Australians were beaten 3-1. That was the series when the wicketkeeper Dennis Lindsay scored 606 runs in 7 innings. And then famously in 1969-70, Bill Laurie's tourists, very ill-advisedly, they flew straight from a 5-test series in India. They then flew to South Africa. And I think their exhaustion is part, but only part, of the explanation for the way in which they were taken apart by Ali Bacher's bristlingly competitive side. Statistically, the 4-0 defeat and the margin of victory in those 4 games remains Australia's heaviest series loss ever to anyone. When the ICC devised its system of ranking international sides and projected it backwards retrospectively, Bacher's 1969-70 side was ranked number 1. And yet, of course, its final game against Australia in 1970 was the last international action seen by a white side representing South Africa for 22 years. Only one of Bacher's 11 who played in that final test ever played test cricket again. In 1992. Who was it? That's a trivia question. The clue, he played for Zimbabwe.
Got to say, John.
John Tricos.
Oh, Tricos going to speak.
That's good. Anyway, that's the question you asked to get a beer in a pub. A team with the world at its feet also had the devil at their shoulder. Or to change metaphors, the monkey on white South African cricket's back was a steady rise of anti-apartheid pressure internationally. Sharpeville, 1960, had appalled world opinion and contributed to sharper criticism, the first boycotts on oil and on arms in the United Nations. But another set of international sanctions gained some traction in the 60s. It proved easier for African and Asian countries to persuade the international community to cut sporting links than it was for them to take any effective economic action. And I've got a list here of sporting sanctions that did bite in the 1960s, the most important of which was South Africa's exclusion from the International Olympic movement. Compared with other sports, in cricket, South Africa's position still seemed reasonably secure. Although South Africa left the Commonwealth in 1961 and automatically forfeited its seat on the ICC, what's being called the Imperial Old Boy Network was alive and well. And Australia, New Zealand and England were perfectly happy to continue playing against South Africa as though it were still a member of the ICC, and to regard its tests as official, although technically they weren't, and they were logged by Wisden and the statistics as official tests.